Okay everybody, here in Ulster we've got a saying where if we get into a difficulty we call it getting into a handlin. Into a handlin. It means getting into a not very pleasant situation. And I'm going to try and describe to you how we got into a handlin quite recently on a fishing boat here in Ireland. The title of my video is Gardner Engines a nightmare. That's maybe a bit of an exaggeration. You know, calling it nightmare is a wee bit of an exaggeration, but that was just for effect. Okay, we were called to a fishing boat, a local fishing boat here, where she was misbehaving. As the skipper described it to us, whenever they tried to pull up the big cage at the back of the boat, the engine was dying. That was one symptom. The other symptom was that whenever she was ticking over, she would start to increase the revs all by herself without any provocation. Steaming out at sea, she was fine, no problem, but otherwise she was misbehaving. So we went down, we seen the symptoms okay, but the first thing we noticed was this screw here. This is the Gardner lift pump. The fuel comes in here, and this connection here was loose. Now that's a no-no, because if it's loose here, she's going to suck air and she's not going to pull as she should. So we tried tightening it up, and we soon discovered that in fact the threads on here, on this female, were stripped. Of course, I did have a certain amount of spares with me, but I didn't have that whole fitting. I wasn't expecting that. So we lost half a day there. That's our first part of the nightmare. We fitted a new screw, this new fitting, the whole new fitting, new washers, new nut, everything, tightened it all up, but she just behaved just the same. Okay, that was our first problem. Now, you can see here from this photograph that the Gardner injection pump is driven by a shaft which comes across from the timing case. But on this engine, somebody had fitted a gear on that shaft. This engine was not a proper marine engine. This was an automotive engine, probably out of a lorry or something, or a bus or something. We ascertained this very quickly because the sump pan was at the front of the engine, not the rear. So this is the shaft that comes across to the injection pump. There's a flange on the injection pump which marries up with this flange, and that's how the rotation is transmitted to the injection pump. Somebody had fitted a gear on here. Now the gear was kept in place by a taper lock pulley. Now this is not a gear, but it'll give you the same idea. You'll see that the taper lock has screws in it here. These little grub screws screw in there, and as they tighten up, that inner part is compressed in and it latches onto the shaft very tight. If you can imagine the gear on the shaft like that and tightened up, it was right up here, very close to that flange. You get the idea? Yeah? You get the idea? But here's the snag. Instead of putting it on like that, they put it on like that. So there was no way, it was quite close, maybe about 5 mil or something like that, of a gap there. There was no way to get an Allen key in there. We couldn't slacken the taper lock. So we couldn't move the gear back. Therefore, we couldn't get at these bolts here. Now, my natural inclination was to take my wee friendly angle grinder and simply cut the gear off, because it wasn't been used for anything. It would have been used on the original road vehicle, perhaps for hydraulics in brakes or power steering or something, I'm not too sure. We couldn't do that. So we couldn't undo these bolts. My idea was to cut the heads off the bolts. The bolts are running through like this. Cut the heads off, and then that would enable us to get the pump taken away. By the way, there was very little light down in the engine room, very, very little light. So you can imagine it was all quite dark down there. That's why I've had to do a certain amount of creative video editing here in order to get this story across to you. But the skipper in the boat wasn't happy with getting the nuts cut off. He insisted that we try and horse the injection pump off without undoing these bolts. And by undoing I think we undid maybe 2 or 3 of these long studs here, we were, with a lot of puffing and a lot of grunting and a lot of difficulty, hence the handling, we were able to struggle and wrench the injection pump back, and we did get it off. That's fine. But whenever we go to put the new one on in its place, that's a real nightmare. Because we had to try and marry the flange on the injection pump with the 4 bolts that were still sticking out here. Okay? Plus, we had to try and marry up the drain-off tube that's underneath the injection pump that runs off the oil that comes into the governor. You'll see that I've marked it on this photograph here. So, a nightmare. We had no choice. I had to ignore the skipper and cut the heads off the bolts. No choice. We had to put the bolts, we had to make up using threaded bar and cap screws and so on, a system where we put the bolts in the other way, and we were able to fit nuts. So we put the nuts through this way, and we were able to fit nuts in here. I hope you can see that on this photograph. Okay. The other problem that we had was on this engine. Okay. Now, this was a fishing boat, and like a lot of boats out there, it had a Japsco pump on here, pumping salt water. You'll see it in this photograph here. Now, the Japsco pump was mounted on a mild steel plate. So you've got to imagine, you've a mild steel plate here, you've got an alloy crankcase here, and you've got salt water running through this Japsco pump. And no matter how much you would try, there's always going to be leaks. So you had salt water dripping down on top of a mild steel plate on top of an alloy crankcase. Dissimilar metals, what do you get? Corrosion. Serious corrosion. Now you have this oil pipe running here, right, which delivers overflow oil from the injection pump back in on top of the timing chain. This is the pipe that does it, and under normal circumstances that pipe just pops off, no problem. There's 2 bolts here, there's 2 bolts there, pop them out and that pipe pops off, no problem. But not in this case. The corrosion in here was serious. I've never seen anything like it. This pipe here was, to all intents and purposes, welded with corrosion and horrible stuff onto the top of the crankcase. We could not get it off. So whenever we were trying to horse the injection pump into place, we had to match it up with this. We had to try and match it up with the 4 bolts on the shaft coming across here, plus the run-off tube down here back to the crankcase. A nightmare. A nightmare. The whole job took us twice, 3 times the length of time that it should have taken us. Now, of course, you'd be quite right to say that a lot of this was my fault, because I should have overridden the skipper. I should have said, look, we're not doing this job unless you cut that gear off. We're not doing this job unless you sort out the corrosion here and get that pipe off. My fault. Okay, so to add insult to injury, on top of all the problems that I've already described, we discovered that there was only one timing mark on the flywheel. Normally, there are 3 different timing marks around here, which greatly ease the job of timing the injection pump and setting the tappets and so on. But on this engine, there was only one, and that was for number 1 top dead center. And there was also an injection mark at 32 degrees. But because we hadn't got the requisite timing marks, it made, again, this job of setting the tappets, timing the injection pump and so on, twice as hard as it should be. It's at this point that I have to thank my dear colleague, Stephen McGarvey, who really put a lot of work into this project. I don't know how I would have managed it without him. It just goes to show that you really need youth at the end of the day.
Thanks.
Anyway, as I said, we got the 4 bolts in facing the opposite of the normal way, but it's all working fine. She fired up no problem. She's developing full power, and she's running like a Swiss watch. Right? Okay, that's it. Hardly really a nightmare, really. But at the time it certainly was very stressful. And of course I didn't relate there our dropping spanners into the bilge and dropping components into the bilge. I can tell you that if you drop a small alloy component into the bilge, it's very difficult to get it back out again because they're not magnetic. Anyway, on we go. We got her going. The customer's back fishing again and quite happy. So thanks a lot for joining me, and see you again soon. That's it.